Well, safe to say that sucked and was not very fun. Kansas goes to Manhattan and loses for the third straight time. By the way, first time they've lost three straight in Manhattan since 1983. So that extra sucks for KU. They fall against K-State 81-73. And unfortunately, we're going to talk about it.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible.
This is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, and I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. And as always, we are brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in possible, member FDIC. If you are joining us live in our live chat on YouTube here after the game today, be sure to drop a comment to share your thoughts. People are already doing that. So thanks so much to people tuning in and dropping a comment, sharing their thoughts after today's game. But certainly a disappointing outcome for KU. They lose on the road against K-State, 81-73. But if you are here and you are sad, one way to cheer yourself up and cheer us up, hit the subscribe button. Subscribe and drop a comment. And also you can subscribe over on our audio platforms as well. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts as well. So, Kevin, Kansas goes on the road to Manhattan, and the storyline certainly at the first half was DeJuan Harris picks up 3 fouls. He picks up his third foul with 10 minutes left in the first half, and that kind of really it probably derailed whatever game plan KU really had to open the game. Kansas hangs around. They end up being down 8 at the half after just a circus of a shot from David Gasson to end the half. And things did not get better for Kansas in the second half.
Let's talk about the positives here, Nick.
Okay, yeah, we can talk positives.
Roll credits. That's it. That was the positives. That was the episode. Now, it was one of those things, Nick, where just so many different things went wrong. And saying went wrong is the wrong way to put it because that's too passive. Kansas did so many things wrong, and it started on the defensive end. And to your point, with DeJuan playing 4 minutes in the first half, you really do not want Doug McDaniel, who's a streaky guy that can be really good and can also be the type of guy that can, kind of take his team out of games at times. You don't want him to get comfortable. And with DeJuan out of the game, it may have been the same if DeJuan was in the game, but Doug McDaniel got comfortable. Kansas State was just getting layup after layup after layup. And it was everybody, right? I know Hunter took blame for defense, and I understand that, and I'm not absolving him at all. But also, at some point, your perimeter guys have to stay in front of people, and they didn't stay in front of people either. And so it was really brutal defensively. Kansas State winds up making 11 of 27 3-pointers. You and I talked about it just before we got on here, Nick. If Kansas State makes 11 3-pointers and shoots better than 40%, you're probably not beating K-State. And a lot of that had to do with Kansas's defense and lack of defense. Some of it also had to do with Kansas State making some shots. And with K-State making those shots, it was going to be really tough. People need to I don't want to say they need to accept. K-State is playing like a really good team right now. We talked about it on the preview episode where Bart Torvik actually had K-State as the number 2 team in the nation over the last 2 weeks, but you can't control the other team. What you can control is what you do. And that was what I thought Kansas never had any control in this game, Nick. And to your point, I'm glad you brought up the Gesson shot because that seemed huge in the moment where Kansas cuts it down to 6. DeJuan Harris has played 4 minutes all first half. You're thinking, oh my gosh, to go into the locker room down only 6 in this situation, it isn't a bad deal. And then he hits a fadeaway with a hand in his face to put him up 8. And it's only 2 points more, but at the same time, it did feel like a pretty big momentum shot. And K-State came out in the second half, and Kansas never really challenged.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those classic, it only counted for 2 points on the scoreboard, but it certainly felt like a lot more, right, when he hit that shot, because you had the big dunk at the other end by Flory to kind of put an exclamation point on KU getting back into the game, only down 6. And then that shot kind of steals away whatever true momentum KU might have had going into the locker room. And then K-State just comes out blazing in the second half. Doug McDaniel hits a couple threes right away. You mentioned it. In the first half, I was watching and I was thinking to myself, hey, good things are happening for KU when Doug McDaniel has the ball, because at times he can be a very reckless player. As a driver, as a like he can take you out of a game offensively if you put the ball in his hands. And I think in the first half he was still trying to warm into the game, and DeJuan wasn't on him. But then he comes out in the second half and hits 2 or 3 threes, and maybe was K-State's best player in the second half of the game, as it turned out. So I thought that was really interesting.
And some of that was with DeJuan on Hausen, which part of that was because of DeJuan's foul trouble. He had 3 fouls, and so you didn't want him on Doug McDaniel. And you said basically, hey, DeJuan, just make sure Hausen's not getting catch and shoot looks. Well, then Doug McDaniel is a little bit more comfortable there than if DeJuan was going into that situation where he was on Doug McDaniel. He only had 1 foul, and he could defend him sort of the way he wanted to defend him.
Yeah, I was tuned into the radio broadcast for a few minutes to start the second half, and that's exactly what Greg Gurley said. He said DeJuan Harris has to be on Hausen because otherwise they're just going to drive right at him with Doug, right? But then you put Zeke Mayo on him, and Zeke Mayo was really struggling. I mean, this may have been one of Zeke Mayo's worst games of the season, unfortunately, which I say that, and then he ended up shooting 3 of 3 from beyond the arc, which is cool, I guess, but he was really bad on defense. And then the one thing that you and I were also discussing before we got started here on the show is, especially in the second half and down the stretch, KU had 5 guys who all wanted to pass. They did not have any guy that wanted to step into a shot. Shaq Moore passed up open looks. Zeke Mayo passed up open looks. Rylan Griffin passed up open looks. Like, you can only have so many guys that are driving to pass or get the ball to pass, right? Like, at some point, somebody has to step up. And I think what we ended up seeing was, I saw a comment in our YouTube live chat from earlier saying, Hunter thought he could shoot us back into the game late. Well, nobody else was shooting, right? Yeah. So it was very, very frustrating to watch, because I think we saw some guys get open looks and just either from a lack of confidence, timid, whatever it may have been, KU just doesn't have anybody, especially from the outside, that seemingly is willing to take those difficult shots, right? And that's where you get really nervous, because what that tells you is that basically you're afraid of failure. And I think anybody in not just in sports, but just in life in general, if you have that mindset where you're too afraid to fail, then you've already lost, right? Like, it's already over at that point. And that's kind of what it seemed like was happening in the second half, where nobody was willing to shoot, right? And Philip Guy has the comment here, like, you're right. It is kind of sad, honestly, because Zeke Mayo has proven he can be a knockdown shooter, obviously, and he ended up 3 of 3 in this game, but still, for whatever reason, down the stretch, just unwilling to shoot the ball. It's one thing when DeJuan Harris does it, because we're kind of used to DeJuan Harris having that style, right? Like, he's the type of player that, he wants to try to create and get inside and try to pass, but you can't have 3 or 4 DeJuan Harrises on the floor. Like, somebody has to be willing to shoot. So that was what was really irritating in the second half, was just a lack of shooting. And Jacob Hopkins comments, KU wasn't shooting the ball very well either. Now, some of that I think was just late sort of chucking from AJ Storr and Hunter Dickinson. But even still, like, it kind of goes back to that. You can't be too afraid to fail. Like, you've got to go out there and try to take those shots if you want to have a chance. And KU just, in some situations, seemingly refused to do that. In other situations was just too scared to do it, I think.
Well, and that's where you hope Rylan Griffin kind of turns the corner with his shot too. He was the guy, if you guys watched the preview episode at all, we pick a player for the game. And it's not necessarily saying, hey, this guy's going to be the best player, but rather this guy is going to have the most impact on whether or not KU winds up winning this game. Wouldn't you agree with that description, Nick?
Yeah. Just a guy to watch, really.
Yeah, and so I had picked Rylan Griffin, and one of the reasons I picked Rylan Griffin was, you watched that Iowa State game. Rylan Griffin was getting some terrific looks, and I felt like, man, if he continues to get those looks, he's a really good shooter. It's a matter of time. Well, he got those looks against K-State. They also didn't go down against K-State. I mean, he had some wide open step into, warm up jumper type 3-pointers that didn't go in. And those are shots that need to go in. on Russ's point about KJ Harris or Dickinson, I'm sure, somebody's going to shoot me from off screen here for saying this, but there is a rule that's out there that could potentially get passed that would allow everybody to have 5 years of eligibility. People that I've talked to feel fairly confident that there's a good chance that could go through. And so Harris and Dickinson, no, next year, there's a chance that KJ Adams could be back next year, a chance that Zeke Mayo could also be back next year. Obviously, there would be a lot of things. In addition to the rule change, they would have to want to come back. KU would have to want them to come back, all of those different things. But there is at least a chance, I think, that we see KJ in a Jayhawk uniform again next year.
And KJ, that's a good segue back into the first half. KJ was the best player in the game, I think, in the first half by far, certainly on both ends of the floor. He ended the first half with 13 points, ended up hitting a little bit of a free throw line jumper where it's one of those shots where if you just hit one, maybe that's enough to free up a little bit of space for other guys when you're that type of player. Because, again, the screenshots were going around of KJ with the ball at the top of the key and nobody within 10 feet of him, as seemingly happens every single game. But he ended up with a really, really great first half, really kind of locked down Coleman Hawkins too on defense, which was significant in the first half. He was great. In the second half kind of faded, but a really strong first half from KJ Adams. And he was by far the best player. And I think probably the reason that KU was even in the situation they were in, like they could have easily been down 10 or 12 at half, possibly without the way he played in the first half.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And like I said, a couple of those 3-pointers for Rylan Griffin go down and you're in a spot where you're down 2 or you're tied or whatever heading in. To me, the offense wasn't nearly as big an issue in this game, Nick. We did our talking about this game on the preview. We both thought that KU would be in the 70s somewhere, right? Like we thought, hey, and both of us picked KU to win, and we're obviously wrong on that front. But I think we figured they'd be 73, 75, 77. KU winds up with 73 points. They shoot 50% from the field. Obviously missed some free throws that you would have liked to see them knock down. Missed some good 3-point looks like we talked about that would have helped overall. But I really felt like the defense was what let them down. K-State really just had easy buckets. And I know Kansas fans aren't typically huge fans of Fran Fraschilla, but he did say something that I was thinking, at about, I think it was about the 8-minute mark, where he was just kind of like, KU's scoring, but they're not making up any ground because they aren't getting any stops. And in some of these games, Nick, like the West Virginia game, when Kansas came back in the Missouri game and didn't wind up quite completing it, but they were making at least Missouri uncomfortable, it started on the defensive end, and they were able to generate stops, and that kind of led them in, and they ultimately didn't have enough offensive pop maybe to quite get over the top. In this one, I never felt like KU was going to come back and win, and the reason I didn't was because it was like, what in the world made you think that KU was going to generate, 5 or 10 stops, in a row in order to make up that ground? And K-State just had it way, way, way too easy on the offensive side. And like I said, credit to K-State. They played well offensively. They made shots, but also Kansas's defense was extremely poor.
I mean, forget getting 5 or 10 stops in a row. Try just getting consecutive stops, just 2 in a row. That was even really tough to do for KU. And yeah, I agree with you. It was a 14-point game with at the under 12 timeout, I think. And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't think KU can come back because the defense was struggling so much, right? And when you're down like that, double digits, I think a lot of people will immediately jump to, oh, well, the offense needs to go score, right? Well, you can score as many times as you want. It has to start on the defensive end, really, in situations like that. And for Kansas, it just wasn't happening. It just wasn't happening on the defensive end. Even when DeJuan Harris got back into the game in the second half, where at halftime I was thinking, okay, the defense hopefully will kind of recover a little bit by getting DeJuan back out there, and that didn't happen, right? K-State just continued to pour it on, continued to get easy shots, and it was just not good, right? Zeke Mayo struggled with guys attacking off the dribble. DeJuan had to play probably a bit more passive with the foul situation he was in. Hunter Dickinson, for as great as he was offensively, he really struggled against Gasson on a number of occasions defensively as well. And Flory really didn't
quick enough and help defense. Yeah, all of those things. Although, again, like if you're playing help defense, that usually means somebody else is broken somewhere else and you're having to help. And so it was all over the place. It really was.
Yeah, that's definitely the story of this game is the defense and the struggles that they had, because in the first half with DeJuan out, you could have maybe chalked it up to that a little bit, but then in the second half, K-State just continued to absolutely just steamroll through the game. And I would push back a little bit on Philip's comment here talking about they should suck at defense with DeJuan and KJ. Again, KJ was the best player, especially in the first half with defense. And with DeJuan, like I said, I feel like in the second half, he probably was forced to play not the way he would have liked to because of the foul situation he was in. So I don't know. I think those two guys, especially KJ, probably
that was a bad third foul too. I mean, he has. I don't know what the heck he was thinking, and
Yeah, I think if you want to get mad at DeJuan, you get mad at him for that for
the third foul.
Yeah, picking up 2 fouls and then like just undercutting Coleman Hawkins for literally no reason on a fading away shot, like to pick up the third foul. That's where I would say you can get mad at him, because we're talking about a guy who's obviously a veteran, one of the guys that has the most starts of any player in college basketball, and you just can't commit that foul in that situation. And yeah, I think I kind of agree with AB here about it doesn't feel like this team has a magic lineup. I would just say, again, it just kind of goes back to, I don't feel like this team has a lineup they can go to where you feel like there's multiple guys that can try to score. I mean, it's really just Hunter Dickinson essentially as a scorer, and they were way too shy on the perimeter, like we mentioned, with some of their 3-point shooting and or lack thereof, and not even we're not even talking about just missing shots. I'm talking about not even taking the shot, right? Like not even putting yourself in a situation to have a chance to make a shot if you don't pull the trigger on it. So very frustrating game, and yeah, I mean, credit to K-State. We talked about it. They have a lot of talent. They went out and basically got a bunch of hired guns out of the transfer portal and mashed them together. And I think now with K-State, we've seen sort of on a macro level, the both ends of the transfer portal, right? You can bring in a bunch of talented players and slam them together on a team, and they may be terrible and they may be 1-6, like we saw from K-State or whatever their record was to start conference play. But if they gel at the right time, they can produce. And obviously from KU's perspective, with guys like Ryland Griffin and AJ Storr, it hasn't quite happened that way. But you would hope that with KU having players that have been in this program, that have been around for a while, to help kind of integrate them in, that you wouldn't have as much of an issue. But it was still a struggle for KU. And yeah, 7-5 now in conference play, and a really disappointing loss for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I like Jacob's point there about 0 lineups that are great on both ends. And I think that's why we've seen Bill Self kind of throwing a lot of really weird lineups together. Is you have some lineups that are pretty good offensively, and you have some lineups that are pretty good defensively. Unfortunately, the guys that are good at offense, not so great at defense. And unfortunately, the guys that are great at defense, KJ, DeJuan, not so great at offense. And so I think that they're trying to find that. And I think people feel like, with Ryland Griffin joining the starting lineup, if he starts making shots, maybe you get a little bit more there, because Ryland Griffin is a guy that defends at a pretty high level, has that in him. His defense, I know we've mentioned on the show before, Nick, but for those of you who didn't watch Alabama last year, his defense was a big part of the reason Alabama reached the Final Four. And so if he's a wing defender and he's making shots, being sort of that NBA 3-and-D archetype, then, you do take a step forward in terms of having lineups that are good at both ends. But if he's not making shots, and specifically not making some of the great looks that he had today, you're not making that turn that everybody wants him to make.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into this game, especially the second half. I want to talk more about kind of what happened at the end of the game.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break, and that means that gives us a chance to talk to you about home field apparel. You can shop home field apparel. I'm rocking the Jayhawks shirt. This is kind of like the baseball script, I guess you would call it, which, by the way, I don't know if you've seen. KU Baseball released some really nice uniforms that they're going to be rocking with, I think, this year. Their season gets started later on next week. KU softball actually started their season this weekend. They played today against Ole Miss, unfortunately lost. But either way, homefieldapparel.com. You can head over there, use the promo code PAYHEAT24 for 15% off your first order if you haven't shopped there before. They've got over 40-plus Kansas items and many other schools as well. Be sure to use that promo code PAYHEAT24, 15% off your first order. And we're back in just a moment.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network, a live edition on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. On this Saturday after the Sunflower Showdown in Manhattan, Kansas falls against K-State 81-73. I'm Nick Springer, here with Kevin Flaherty as always. And of course, we're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC as well. And Emprise Bank can help you out with small business loans. That's what they're known for, SBA loans. So be sure to check them out over at Emprise Bank, as they're helping out many small businesses in the Kansas City and surrounding areas as well. So be sure to check out Emprise Bank, as they are great sponsors with us here on the show. So late in the game, Kevin, there's a couple things I wanted to touch on towards the end of the game that just didn't really set right with me. And I wanted to see what your comment was.
All right.
First and foremost, Kansas gets it to 79-70 with about 30 seconds left, I think. And they end up getting the steal. They steal it away. And Shaq Moore just falls down on the ground, and they give it right back on a jump ball. Just a disastrous sequence. And then if you go back even further than that, they had cut it to 9 again, I think, and with like 50 seconds left, and they didn't foul, and they were trying to trap and just ended up giving up an easy lob. I was left scratching my head quite a bit at some of the – I mean, obviously it didn't – I don't think it really was going to matter. I don't know that KU was going to come back, but K-State was – it seemed like K-State a little bit was trying to open the door for KU, and they just refused to walk through it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like you said, in the grand scheme of things, it probably didn't matter. but at the same time, it was an area where it felt like a Mason Graham team, makes a play, and they may not win the game, but it feels like that was a situation where they at least make things a little bit uncomfortable. I didn't understand the situation necessarily not to foul after trying the trap and everything and stretching things out. But also, I mean, they were down quite a bit at that point. And so I get that you're kind of like, well, you don't want it to go that way. Interestingly enough, I know somebody had said, KU got blown out in this game. It wasn't close. Earlier, I'm sorry, I can't remember who said it. Maybe was it Philip? Were you the one that said that? Yeah, thank you. And that's a great point. This was kind of the opposite of the Iowa State game in Ames, right? In that game in Ames, Kansas hung around. Kansas was there, and Iowa State hit some shots late to pull it out, and a 17-point loss looked really bad in the final score department. But ultimately, it wasn't. It wasn't a game that was separated by that much for the most part. To Philip's point, this was one that was the exact opposite. Kansas ultimately loses by 8. Somebody who is a media member that votes in the AP poll, not that matters, who didn't watch the game is going to open it up and be like, oh, they lost by 8 on the road, no big deal. But it certainly felt more emphatic than that. Kansas State controlled this game, and there wasn't ever a single moment in the second half that it felt like Kansas had wrested control back. And so I think that was one of my main takeaways from this one, was just that it was all Kansas State. It really was.
Yeah, and Levi's comment here, I think, sort of encapsulates a point we've been talking about over the course of the season, which is when things are going well, this team looks good. When things are easy for them, it looks good. But a little bit of adversity, a little bit of fight back from the opponent, and they really seem to have a hard time sort of getting back on their feet and stabilizing and fighting back, right? I mean, we saw it a little bit in some games earlier this season, but certainly in conference play, I think we've seen a number of games where it just felt like when things get tough, this team really struggles. And I think that kind of goes back to, some real timid shooters on the outside. You have, when you're leaning on Hunter Dickinson so much on the interior, and it's kind of easy to take him away for opposing teams at times, depending on the lineup you have out there with him. That makes it really difficult. And then obviously in this game against K-State, that becomes compounded by the fact that you had probably one of your worst defensive games of the season, I would say. Sure. I mean, with how
it probably was their worst, with the possible exception of UCF when Dewan didn't play. I mean, KU was getting absolutely smoked down the stretch before they moved somebody over onto Hall. But at the same, and that's somebody being KJ. But yeah, this was definitely up there. If it's not the worst defensive performance they had all year, it's certainly in that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Hunter Dickinson finishes with 21. Zeke Mayo ends up finishing with 15. You look at his stat line, 15.7 rebounds, 5 assists. But something you'd pointed out to me is Zeke had 5 turnovers, and he really struggled with giving the ball away in this game.
Yeah, he had not that plus minus is everything, but he had the third worst, plus minus on the team. It was good to see Zeke's shots fall on the road, but you also wanted to take care of the ball. Also, K-State turns the ball over, and KU was not close enough defensively to force guys into turnovers. They made it look pretty easy. K-State is a team that will give the ball away if you put them in situations to do so. And Kansas didn't do that. Great point by Jacob on the second half of the Baylor game defensively. That was probably peak, just awful defense. It's a half and not a full game, but
that's what I was going to say.
That was just brutal.
Certainly the Baylor game was the worst half of defense, but
yes,
if you're talking about an entire game, this one's got to be up there for KU against K-State, and it just never really got any better. That was the real issue is, KU was able to score offensively, but no stops, and K-State just kept them at arm's length the entirety of the second half.
Yeah, it's an interesting deal because I do think, we've had a lot of comments about this team not having any fight. And generally speaking, Nick, I think they have more fight than they had a year ago. You look at that West Virginia game, the Missouri game in particular, I feel like last year's team would have rolled over and died in those games and not had the comeback attempts. But this is one, it didn't get like a whole lot worse. It wasn't like, you remember Texas Tech where KU just got run off the court a year ago? And just didn't look like they wanted to be in Lubbock or anything like that. Kansas hasn't really had that game, I don't think. So I do think there is a little bit more fight. What we've talked about on the show quite a bit is the focus is so inconsistent. And it's not even effort as much as focus and making the right decision, going to the right place. If you're going to play help defense, like being so focused on defense, that it's not like they aren't hustling to get there. It's that they're starting too late, right? And so when you don't have that consistent focus, it makes it really difficult. And we did this live show for those of you who were here after the Iowa State win, and one of the things that we had said was to watch out for something like this, because we said as great as that game was, and I think people were pretty fired up about that win. We never doubted that this team has an A game that's really, really good. What we doubted was this team's consistency and ability to stack strong games back to back to back to back. And with K-State playing as well as it was coming in, there's a reason we said on the preview show that for KU to win this game, it would be one of the biggest wins of the season. And instead, you wound up with another really inconsistent showing, especially defensively. Somebody asked earlier what the strength of this team is. It was defense. This is a team that came in with the top 5 defense in the country from an efficiency standpoint, and they just didn't show up defensively. And so we said, somebody, I think after maybe it was after the Baylor game, Nick, somebody said, what does this KU team do consistently? And it's be inconsistent. And
yeah,
the one thing about it is now you're in a spot where you're playing some of the teams that have really struggled in Big 12 play. You have a chance to build some confidence, to kind of maybe find some answers. If Rylan Griffin starts refining his shooting stroke, etc., you have a chance to come out of that stretch feeling a lot better about yourself. But man, it would have been really nice to show up and show a lot of mental toughness and compete in this one to the extent that they didn't really compete.
A couple of comments here from Russ about players in the portal. Cooper mentioned about roster construction as well. And these are tricky questions to answer, really tricky questions to navigate. With Russ's question about self-choosing wrong players in the portal or players just not buying in. I mean, the portal, to me at least, it's more or less a crapshoot, I think, in a lot of situations. I mean, you look at a guy at what he was able to do at whatever previous school he was at, and it's hard to guess how players are going to react playing for different teams. And look, let's not be shy about it. Playing for Kansas is probably puts the most pressure on a player for a team you could play for of any team in the country, right? Like the pressure to play for the name on the front of the jersey at Kansas is higher than probably any other school in the country outside of, like, I guess Duke or maybe Kentucky, sort of. And so it's really tough, right? It's really, really tough. I think I do think with Self, we've talked about this sort of a couple of times over the course of the season. Depending on how the rest of the season plays out, yes, I do think Bill Self probably and his staff need to take a step back and really re-examine what they're looking for in the transfer portal. I think from Bill Self's standpoint, and he's actually had a couple comments about this sort of publicly about it. Oh, hey, let's go get the best players and I'll figure out how to make them work together, right, regardless. And that just hasn't really quite worked. So I don't know if KU needs to start looking for guys that they think are going to be better system fits or how that works out. But it's a really tough question. And like I said, it's kind of a crapshoot because you may get Nick Timberlake, or you may get somebody who ends up being a really quality player like Remy Martin, who helps KU win the national championship. But even I mean, just if you just look at the case study on Remy Martin, you could argue, was a failure as a transfer as well for the 90% of the season, but then he helps you win a national title. So what if the same thing happens with AJ Storr this year, where he just gets randomly really hot in March and helps KU make a deep run? I don't know. I don't think it's just really tough. And I think compounded by that, we've talked about this as well, is Self, he has a system and he's not going to change that system for players to a player. And so I think if you're KU, maybe you start to look at players that you think are going to fit into the system better, rather than just trying to find the best player and mold them to Self system. And then I mentioned this on a live show, I think after the Iowa State loss, maybe on the road, you compound all of that with the fact that the elephant in the room is Bill Self may not be coaching in 3 years or 4 years. So if you want to take like a step back and do this comprehensive big picture look at how you think KU should be attacking the transfer portal or recruiting or whatever, and if it's something that requires multiple years of tinkering, Bill Self may not be around for long enough to really figure that out. So you're kind of stuck in this spot where I think if you're KU, maybe you just have to kind of ride out how Bill Self wants to do it essentially for the next couple of years before you start to maybe consider other options. And the only other thing I would say about that is I would say two things. Number one, I think KU fans should be very careful. I don't think you want to be anything like what happened with Calipari at Kentucky. You want to make sure that Bill Self can go out and never coach another game for another school. At least I personally don't want to see Bill Self coaching another game for another school, period. So that's number one. So I would say don't run him out of town, basically. But number two, I think KU is going to be in a good spot regardless because I trust Travis Goff. Travis Goff has done a great job with hiring. I think whenever that time comes, and knowing Travis Goff, he's probably already spending some time thinking about this, right? I mean, he has to be, I would think, already doing some preliminary, looking around essentially about that possibility. But I trust Travis Goff. So those are all the issues floating around in my mind, at least, is with recruiting, with the transfer portal, with how you want to approach that. And then you add on the fact that Self's future, at least long-term future, I think is in question probably beyond the next 2 to 3 years. You kind of end up with this sort of just throw your hands up and say, well, I guess you just let Self do what he wants to do and just kind of live with the consequences, I guess. I mean, I don't think Self is going to absolutely tank the program. I mean, I know people feel like this program has been on a bit of a downslide the past couple of years, and I think the results probably do reflect that a little bit. But this is still a blue blood. This is still the top 2 or 3 program in the country for sure, and I don't think that's going to change with Self, even if over the next 2 to 3 years. So I don't know. It's obviously a very, very tough question to sort of chew around with and gnaw at, and how you want to approach it.
Yeah, I get all that. And if you look at UConn this year, UConn's having a lot of similar struggles in terms of trying to rebuild that roster. And Dan Hurley can coach with anybody in the country, obviously. And so it's not something that's unique to KU. Obviously, North Carolina is having the year that it's having. Kentucky it's hard to say anything about Kentucky because it's first year of Mark Pope. They've had some really nice highs. They've also had some pretty low lows. It's not easy to be consistent in this era. I know somebody had said, I can't remember who it was, Rush Shaw had talked about Kobe Bryant. They tried with Kobe.
Kobe Bryant was a priority target, I think.
Yeah,
sure.
They absolutely went out to try and get Kobe. It didn't work out. And sometimes you have bad luck in the portal, as weird as that sounds. I don't want to rip on Nick Timberlake, but like KU was between, like, they had an offer out to Nick Timberlake and Dalton Connect. Like, if Dalton Connect comes to KU, then things maybe look vastly different last year because you have a first-team All-American that you got out of the portal. Timberlake made his decision first, and so KU wound up with Timberlake in that situation. So some of the portal, it's luck, it's fit. I know somebody had mentioned KU's shooters not shooting well out of the portal. Zeke's hitting 50 or 41% from 3. So I mean, Zeke might be your first one. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I know Isaiah Moss didn't really shoot all that well. He was shooting better, I feel like, at the end of the year, but
I mean, Malik Newman also had another run in March, obviously.
Yeah, Remy Martin, isn't like a pure shooter, was more scorer than shooter, but obviously shot the ball pretty well. They've had a couple guys, but for the most part, guys haven't shot the ball as well the next year the way that they did. So, but yeah, it's an interesting era in college basketball, and I think when you're looking at Kansas for next year, if your base is Flory at center and Peterson at point guard. And those of you who haven't seen Peterson play, he's unbelievable. He's special. Like, he may be the best player / prospect in the country. He was just outside of like that number 1 range. He's now moved up to number 2, and the conversation is, well, should he be at number 1? I think it'll help Kansas to have kind of a score first point guard again. That's not a knock on DeJuan, because I think DeJuan is a really nice complementary piece, but the problem with complementary pieces is their impact is so different based on what other guys are doing. And so if the guys around DeJuan aren't knocking down shots, then DeJuan's not going to be as effective. And so Peterson being compared to Paul Pierce, Peterson's a point guard. He's playing point guard at Prolific Prep right now. Kansas has pitched to him, and getting him to come to Kansas was, hey, we're going to let you be an NBA style point guard here. So he plays a different position, but he's just a terrific player, competitive, competes on defense as well. And so it'll be interesting to see how the portal's handled, whether you bring back and whether he decides to come back guys like Rylan Griffin, to be as part of that mix. Hopefully you get a healthy Elmarco Jackson, who the word on Elmarco in the spring right before the injury was that he was playing very well, that he had regained his confidence, that he was starting to look a lot more like the McDonald's All-American type guy that KU had recruited it. And so from the long-term roster projection standpoints, and it's weird to say in this era of college basketball, long-term roster projections just mean next year, right? Like you can't look at something and say, hey, this is the team that Bill Self is building for 2027. It doesn't work like that. And so I'm interested to see how they fill that roster stuff. But I will say, somebody asked if we'd given up on this year's team, and I haven't yet, Nick. And part of the reason why is inconsistency still an issue. Today, brutal. It really was. I still think there's a world where if Rylan Griffin is making outside shots, you get enough of that blend of offense and defense to win a few NCAA tournament games. And at that point, a lot depends on matchups. You know, the 2022 team that won it all might not have been a top 5 Bill Self team, but the matchups in the NCAA tournament favored them. And the other part of it is the matchups can favor you, but you have to take advantage. You know, not a lot of people know this, but I covered VCU at the 2011 NCAA tournament, in part because I was down there working for Fox covering Texas, and that regional was in San Antonio. And so they basically said, who do we have down there that, you know, is not one of our major guys, because our major guys are going to cover KU and Florida State or whatever. And so they're like, hey, kid, you know, go cover VCU and get out of our way. That was a team where the tournament absolutely fell to that team to get VCU in the Elite Eight. You would have had Butler in the Final Four, and you would have had a very flawed UConn team in the final. They didn't take advantage of that, and the 2022 team did. All of that's a really long way to say I'm not giving up on this team, because they do have a fastball. Like we said, their A game, I think, is pretty impressive, and that is more my worry with some other teams where you say, hey, even if this team plays their A game, can they beat a top tier team? I don't think that's a question with this team. I think it's just a matter of getting that A game more often, finding more consistency. And to your point, you've made several times, Nick, this stretch coming up is maybe a chance for you to build some confidence, build some consistency, and head into those final, you know, few really tough games with a lot of confidence and believing that you can win those. Because you get Texas Tech at home, then you go to Houston, then you have Arizona back at Allen Fieldhouse right afterwards. And if Kansas winds up, Nick, taking all 3 of those games or 2 of those 3 after this stretch, then we're going to feel a lot different about this team than we do right now.
Yeah, you look at those last 3 games you just highlighted. That's number 8, number 3, and number 12 in KenPom, if you're keeping track consecutively to end the season. But on the positive side, your upcoming 5 games, which, like you said, I've been talking about. Colorado, who is 0-for in the conference. They're playing Houston today. They're probably not going to win that one, I would think.
Yeah.
You get Colorado at home. You go to Utah, who's 86 in KenPom. You have that tough game at BYU, which is going to be a tough one in Provo. But then you get Oklahoma State, who's 108 in KenPom at home. And then you go at Colorado again. So you get Colorado, who's not won a conference game this whole season, twice in the next 5 games, plus Oklahoma State at home. You do go at Utah, which you should win. And then at BYU is the one tough one. But if you go 5-0 in that stretch and start to build up some confidence, like you said, and then you're able to finish the year with maybe getting at least 2 of those games, you know, maybe you win your 2 home games against Tech and Arizona, you're probably going to be feeling a lot better at that point in time. But this is sort of their last chance, right? I mean, I think you could maybe make a break. Okay, post February 8th versus pre-February 8th, what's going to happen? That to me is sort of where this game comes down, where this season comes down to, is this next upcoming stretch. You pretty much have to go 5-0 in that stretch. And then you look at the last 3 games, and if you win 2 of those, or maybe win all 3, then you could be right back in a position where you're feeling really good heading into March. So, or I guess at that point, going beyond March. Russ asks an interesting question. Any chance they still play in Wichita? I would say maybe. I think you probably need to be a 2 seed to play in Wichita, which doesn't seem likely. But again, you're going to have a chance to potentially grab a couple more really, really high-quality wins coming up at the beginning of March, right before the end of the season. So I'm not going to rule it out, but it does seem unlikely at this point that they would still have a chance to play in Wichita in the NCAA tournament. But yeah, that's the one positive, I guess, that I would take away from today is you've got these upcoming stretch of 5 games, 4 of which you should be able to win. One that will be tough on the road against BYU. But if you're able to get right over those 5 games, we'll see where things go from there. But it does feel like KU's probably more likely going to end up as a 4, maybe a 3 seed at this point, if they're lucky. So that would probably take them out of Wichita, I would guess, without knowing exactly all the sites for this upcoming tournament. Not 100% sure, but if you can set this one aside and set things straight heading into these next 5 games, you might feel a little bit better by the end of February, maybe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And sorry for you guys that heard my dog just like hacking up a lung over on the side. She's 14 years old, so she comes by it honestly. But no, it really is. I do think that there is a fastball that this team can find. They just need to find it more often than they have, Nick. And to your point about whether they wind up a number 3 or a 4 seed, I think it's important to note. I think it's important to note that Bill Self has done incredibly well in first round and Sweet 16 matchups. Kansas hasn't lost in an odd numbered round since Villanova in the Final Four in 2018, and that was just basically Villanova playing shooting practice in that game, and wasn't something in coaching. That's the only time the last 10 years Kansas has lost in an odd numbered round, and so I think it's probably going to come down to a round of 32 game, and what they wound up. What they wound up doing. Sorry, my thought just kicked out. The matchup that they wound up getting in that round of 32. Sorry, I glitched there, guys. I think that'll wind up determining a lot because I do think you give Bill Self and this group a week to prepare. Kansas was well prepared in the first round game last year. If you remember, they built a huge lead and then kind of took their foot off the gas that wound up really putting that game in an uncomfortable spot late. But when I think about coming out in those early round games in the first round, the third round, when you have a full week to prepare, Kansas has generally done really, really well in those games of coming out, preparing well, playing well. It's just last year they had to put their foot down better than they did. I think they thought the game was over and it wasn't over. And quite frankly, that's a trait that this year's team has shown it at times as well. But I do like this team to win a first round game. I just think that round of 32 game, it could basically be the game that, as weird as it sounds, decides whether they go out in the first weekend or whether they head into the Elite Eight with the chance to go to the Final Four, because I do like their chances to play really well in the Sweet 16 game as well.
AB with the comment, Kansas has one Sweet 16 appearance in 7 seasons. But what happened that one year they went to the Sweet 16? Oh, that's right.
Also, that's not fair because they didn't get 2020. Like that's not that 2020 team. I really feel like not just that they were the favorites to win the national title because they were, and not just that they were head and shoulders better than everybody else because they were, but also, Nick, I don't know how you felt about that, but I thought that they were as upset proof as just about anybody in that field because of the way they defended, the fact that Doak was, the best player in the country over the last, month or so of that season. I really thought they might have gotten beat because somebody just came out who was also really good and just outplayed them. But I do not think that team had much of a chance at all to not reach the Sweet 16.
Well, for this team, certainly a lot of questions still remain after today losing in Manhattan 81-73. They're now 7-5 in conference play and in danger of maybe falling out of the top 25. That's something we didn't really touch on. They came into this game this week at 16 in the country. So
I feel like everybody else is losing too, though. Like that's the only thing about it is since that last poll, KU has a giant win over Iowa State and then an 8-point loss to K-State in Manhattan, which again, if you know the AP people, they don't watch every game. And so there is a lot of score sheet watching where it's just kind of like, oh, KU lost by 8 in Manhattan. No big deal. And so, I think they wind up staying in, and they may wind up staying, fairly close to where they're at just because of what's happening all around them. And is it UConn's? UConn was still ranked too, and UConn lost to St. John's yesterday.
Yeah, St. John's, by the way, 12-1 in the Big East. That is that's crazy. Quite the renaissance.
Did you hear Patino's comment after the game?
I did. Somebody asked him about what he would think if he'd been told back in like November that they were going to be 12-1, and he was like, "I would be mad about the one loss or something."
He used an F-bomb. Yeah, he said, "I would ask how the bleep we lost that one game or whatever." So
yeah, and Philip here mentioned Zuby Ejiofor is on.
Zuby's been great, and I think one of the interesting things about it is everybody wants to draw the. If you had Ernest Uday, if you had Zuby rather than Hunter, where would you be? It's an impossible question to answer, but I will say this: St. John's defense is one of the best in the country, and Zuby's doing a great job, on the back end of that defense. So credit to that kid. I always really liked Zuby. I'm glad to see him finding success.
Yeah, Zuby to me was a player that you could have looked at and said, in 2 or 3 years, he will be a really, really quality player. Yeah. And if he had been on if he had been on Kansas in 2012 or something, he would have turned into maybe like a Landon Lucas type of player. But unfortunately, in this portal era and with KU getting Hunter Dickinson, you see guys like that depart, which is really frustrating because Zuby's a great example of a player that that Bill Self would have been able to develop him into a really, really quality player, and he's gone on to be a really quality player anyways. And you would have loved to see him stick around, but that's just the era of the transfer portal, right? You're gonna swing on some guys coming in, and you're gonna let some guys walk that maybe end up having solid careers elsewhere, and that's just kind of how it goes. And it's really frustrating, certainly, but that's just the era we're in, and we'll see how long that continues. So, Kansas will be back in action on Tuesday against Colorado, back at Allen Fieldhouse. As I said, Colorado. They are winless in Big 12 conference play. They are playing Houston today. Probably not going to win that game. So good luck to Colorado because KU is going to be at home again and probably a little upset after what happened today against K-State. So we'll be back probably later in the week, maybe talking that KU Colorado game and more here on the show. Kevin, before we get out of here, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, today was a day that I think I went into it feeling like there was a chance something like this would happen, especially with KU's lack of consistency this year. And it was something that I wanted them to prove me wrong, right? Like you wanted them to come out, put their foot down, and show everybody like, hey, this is who we are now. We squashed Iowa State. We go into Manhattan, get a tough win. They didn't, but that doesn't mean that I'm out on the season or anything like that. It's going to be a very important stretch coming up. I don't say you want to flush this one necessarily, Nick, but I do think it's another example that you say, hey, you got to have that focus and if you're going to be a great defense, you need to be that defense all the time because K-State is a team that is, even with how well they've been playing, the offense has been good, but not necessarily elite, and KU made them look like an elite offense today.
Thanks so much to everybody that hung out with us in the live chat. Really appreciate you guys sharing your comments, sharing your thoughts on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. If you're watching after the fact, you can still drop a comment to share your thoughts as well. And if you're listening on the audio platforms after the fact, you can hit us up on our 5-star rating and review to share your thoughts there. Also, tons of ways to get in contact with us here on the show. Special thank you to everybody that hung out with us. Thank you to to Philip, as well as AB and many others that were in the comments for the show here today. Really appreciate all of you for joining us today, even in a loss. So really appreciate that so much. We're going to talk to you probably again later this week after KU Colorado, maybe and beyond as well. But until then, take care, everybody. Enjoy the Super Bowl, by the way. One other thing I didn't mention is over the last 3 years, or I guess the past 2 seasons, KU loses right before the Chiefs play a playoff game. The Chiefs win. So KU loses today. Maybe that spells Super Bowl champion three-peat for the Kansas City Chiefs possibly tomorrow afternoon. So enjoy that. Stay safe this weekend, and we will talk to you again soon. See ya.